The Guardian published an op-ed by Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz called "The Climate Crisis is Our Third World War. It Needs a Bold Response." And his main argument is that the cost of fighting climate change is really irrelevant because climate change is an existential threat. And so he asks, when the US was attacked during the Second World War, no one asked, can we afford to fight the war? It was an existential matter. We could not afford not to fight it. The same goes for the climate crisis. Now, the first thing that I'll point out is I want to encourage everybody to watch or rewatch and definitely share Alex's Green New Deal video that went up, I guess, last week from Prager University. If you just go and search on YouTube for Alex Epstein Green New Deal, it'll come up. It's gotten well over 1 million hits just on YouTube alone, let alone all of the internet. And it addresses exactly this idea that we have to do something like the Green New Deal because climate is an existential threat. But there are some new things that come out in Stiglitz's piece that I wanted to talk about. So, with that in mind, he goes on to say that or just if you think about what he's saying when he's saying like, look, this is like World War II and we have to fight it. So one piece of context that we have to keep in mind at the outset is just the sheer destructiveness of World War II. And I mean, definitely that includes the just un, unbelievable number of lives lost. I mean, millions upon millions. But I'm just talking about, for the purposes of this piece, the economic toll. Like if you look at what it cost America, which bore a relatively small part of it, we still spent years where Americans lived in a far lower standard of living, in many ways, even than the Depression. That is, they had jobs, but there was so much rationing and restrictions on economic activity in order to enable fighting the war that people really endured genuine deprivations. And it was a real tragedy, but it was necessary. But obviously you don't want to go fighting wars if you can avoid it, even if you're only just looking at the economic costs. And I would think that that would be non-controversial, that like war is not really a great economic endeavor. But it turns out that Stiglitz disagrees. Like he thinks that World War II and his war on climate change would be good for the economy. So he says the war on the climate emergency, if correctly waged, would actually be good for the economy. See, I didn't just make that up. Just as the Second World War set the stage for America's golden economic era, the fastest rate of growth in its history amidst shared prosperity. So, what he's really saying here is it would have been a tragedy, or at least an economic tragedy, if the US hadn't had to fight World War II. Like, his view is supposedly that, like, we would have been poor and not had prosperity if there were more Americans still alive, if Americans hadn't suffered through years of deprivations, of rationing, if there hadn't been incalculable amounts of wealth like oil and steel and rubber that were turned into tanks, bullets, and bombs rather than things that actually enhance people's standard of living. So his view is, yeah, that we would have been all poorer if that would have just been used to make people more prosperous. And I mean, the reality is that post-war prosperity, well, notice that it's post-war. It was precisely made possible by the fact that we were no longer at war. We were able to roll back regulations and taxes that had been in place even before the war with the New Deal. This is the first New Deal, not the green one. And it was that unleashed a real wave of prosperity. Now, how in the world can Stiglitz arrive at this kind of conclusion? How can he think that scrapping cheap, plentiful, reliable energy and the billions upon billions of capital invested in it and all the skills that are embodied in people who have spent a lifetime learning how to get it and bring it to the market and provide us with affordable power for all kinds of uses? Um, how can he believe that the raising taxes and spending trillions of dollars we don't have today, how does he believe that that's going to create prosperity? And I mean, he tells us his answer. He says the Green New Deal would stimulate demand, ensuring that all available resources were used, and the transition to the green economy would likely usher in a new boom. I like that likely. I would love that quantified. Like, okay, what's the case? What is the unlikely case in his view? But that setting that aside, there's two fundamental ways of understanding the cause of prosperity. So, one way is that prosperity is really the product of the free human mind finding out better and better ways to create wealth. But the other view, which is very widespread, including amongst many economists, is effectively sees prosperity as magical. It's like we automatically innovate, we automatically create wealth. Like that's the easy part. That just like you don't have to really do anything for that to happen. The hard part is just making sure there's demand for products and services. And so, well, how are we going to make sure that there's demand? And the answer is, well, we'll just have the government borrow and spend or even just print up a bunch of money. And in economics, this view is called Keynesianism, but that's a bit unfair to Keynes because like he would have never dreamed of applying it to today's situation of enormous prosperity and low unemployment. He was talking about how to deal with a temporary lull in aggregate demand. And you can debate whether he was right there. But the idea that in today's context, that's an even plausible way to think about things, I think is just you can't appeal to Keynes even for that. And Stiglitz's argument is actually worse than that, though, I think, because he's not just talking about stimulating demand. It's really Keynesianism plus good old Soviet style central planning of the economy. That's what the Green New Deal is, right? Because it's not just saying, like, let's throw a bunch of money at the economy and then we'll have demand. It is, let's throw it precisely at what the government says. These are the kinds of energy sources to use. These are the kinds of technologies. This is the kind of economic activity you should engage in. You should be installing this kind of insulation in a building and so on. And I mean, by this logic, Venezuela before Chavez should have been poor, and Venezuela after Chavez should have been rich because after Chavez, they had way more government control of the economy, way more central planning, and way more government spending of money. Finally, let me point this out. I've indicated this a little bit. The whole thing is just completely sloppy and vague, right? Like he has that line about, it's likely to generate all kinds of great economic activity. And if you were really accepted that there was this a real dire problem with CO2, this sort of like general, well, let's just have some sort of Green New Deal, like that would not follow at all. You would be thinking about like what are our different options, what are the costs and benefits of different approaches, and you see none of that in Stiglitz. And certainly you see no concern for one of the things you should be most concerned about, which is the cost of energy. Like Stiglitz is allegedly this brilliant economist and he does not discuss the cost of energy at all, like not a word about it. He doesn't discuss various policy alternatives. It's just we have to do something. The Green New Deal is something, therefore we have to do it. And you might accuse me of like this. If he's a Nobel laureate in economics, it cannot be as bad as you're saying. So it must be a straw man, Watkins. But I really encourage you to go look up this piece. But I mean, this is par for the course for Stiglitz. He was effectively the arch villain in my book Equals Unfair on a slightly different group of issues. But he's just so filled with hatred of capitalism that like he'll invoke any idea in order to oppose it, even if it is completely sloppy and completely unsupported. Stefan, I'm curious if you had a chance to read this and what your impressions were.
I must say I haven't read it, but I'm fascinated by this analogy to World War II because I think it mattered a great deal that America was able to, put out so many more tanks and aircraft and ship tonnage and so on over the course of World War II, and especially in warfare, in strategic warfare, economics matter a lot. It matters a lot how you spend your resources and how you use them. Now it's a more central planning approach, but this is important, and it's this essentially argues for staying in this wartime economy, and this I think, as you said, with Venezuela, I think this resembles more like Eastern Europe after World War II. Stagnating economy, falling behind. The entire population being poor because of the central planning in the areas where the Soviet Union ruled. versus the Western allies and the freed part of Germany in the Western Hemisphere, then going to prosperity because it was free, right? So I'm very fascinated how like economists ignore this connection between good and bad economics during wartime, because it's important how you spend your resources, especially in wartime. Like Japan could have was pretty much devastated, and only with the help of America was able to recover from this war. And it's not like, oh, we fight a war and then we're better off.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point. By his, like you would really, if you were really thinking about the issue, you'd ask, all right, what has been the aftermath of war for other economies rather than America during World War II? And then, okay, if they all just like leap to prosperity, maybe that would be at least a question of, oh, is there something about war that creates prosperity? But that is so the exception. And I did mention my book Equals Unfair. I actually talk about precisely this issue of, well, why did we have a post-war boom? And so I encourage anybody who's interested in that to see my book.